read Gypsy Rose Blanchard's new book so that you don't have to, but I already returned it back to the library because I thought that this app was going away and I wasn't going to be able to make this video, and yet here we are. So I'm just going to pop a picture up on the screen. Disclaimer, this isn't going to be like a review of this book. The reason that I read it in the first place was because I heard that this book was full of contradictions, so I wanted to read them for myself and see what was happening with it. So we're going to be talking about some of those contradictions in this video, as well as there was one main concern that I had with this book that really solidified a theory that I already had about Gypsy, which we'll be talking about at the end of this video. So let's get started. Just a quick little disclaimer, I did, like I said, get this book from the library, which I'm aware is still supporting the author, but I don't think it's quite as bad as me just buying the book outright, especially knowing that this isn't a book that I would ever want to hold on to, and I think she's already made enough money off of this whole situation. But nonetheless, let's get started. So one of the main contradictions in this book was that she really tried to hit home with the fact that she did not walk around at all, even when she was in the privacy of her own home with her mother. Like, her mother was insistent that she use a wheelchair all the time, and Gypsy has been asked in interviews if she lost muscle mass because of using a wheelchair all the time, supposedly, and she said no, which a lot of people said that that's literally impossible for how many years that she would have had to be in a wheelchair and not using her legs. But I'm not a doctor, so I'm not going to linger on that one too long, although I will say that if you look at pictures of like their house, I feel like a lot of the pictures, the house is very cluttered looking, so I feel like being in a wheelchair and moving around in that would have been a pretty difficult time, but that's just me. One of the next contradictions is, of course, the one that I've heard about the most is the Barbie quote, which is basically something along the lines of Gypsy saying in this book that her mother did not let her play with Barbies. She was only allowed to play with baby dolls because her mother didn't want her to know anything having to do with snacks, but that Barbie's bodies were too formed, I guess, rather than like baby doll bodies, so she wasn't allowed to play with Barbies. But there's quite literally interviews again with Gypsy. I think there's one where she's sitting next to her mother where she mentions having Barbies, so that automatically is a contradiction in her own words. But also in a later chapter of this book where she talks about being in prison and experimenting with women, she talks about how her only like concept of lesbians was that when she was growing up, she watched Xena Warrior Princess. You know who else watched that growing up? Me. And that is a very sexual TV show if you haven't seen it. So I think it's a little bit odd that her mom